We should get started. So, hello everybody, distinguished panelists, dear participants. I would like to warmly welcome you to this event. A special welcome goes to our board members, Ulrike, Katharina Kratzmann and Axel Greinbrink. Also Thomas Held signed up. A hello to Albert Ferruccio and Olga. Sorry I can't see you. This is the price we have to pay for this technology. In total, we have about 100 participants from 15 countries. That's probably the advantage of these kind of online events. Others we actually had to decline, I'm afraid, as we were oversubscribed. The panel debate, just to give you a bit of background, is part of our still relatively new 5 years project on forced migration and refugee studies, networking and transfer, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research. And key to our project is participating in, contributing to, and setting up, where necessary, networks in the field of forced migration and refugee studies, strengthening research collaboration and teaching, and stakeholder engagement. And to this end, we hold regular workshops like this one, collaborate in the German Refugee Research Network Conference. 2 weeks ago, we had over 900 participants, and prepare a fellowship program for international visitors. So please visit our website, ffvt.net, and get in touch if any of this is relevant to you. Unfortunately, it was not possible to hold this event live. Therefore, we have arranged this Zoom webinar. And this means that only the panelists are able to use their cameras and microphones. For the audience, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions. The chair, Ulrike, will read them to the panelists. At the end, we aim to publish the panel debate, but not the discussion, as a video cast on our new YouTube channel. Professor Ulrike Krause will chair most of the event. She will be supported in the background by Marcel Berlinghoff. You can't see him, but you see his name, I suppose, who will collect your questions and comments. And now back to our event. Who is a migrant and who is a refugee? This is a very tricky, if not toxic question. It's loaded with implications, with emotions, whilst the answer has enormous consequences for the affected individuals in terms of their treatment, legal status, and rights. And those who determine who is what, thus exercise significant power over these people. The usage of these two categories implies that we can neatly distinguish between arrivals at our borders or on our territories, that people can accordingly labeled and sorted, and that there is such a dichotomy. However, in their works, our panelists made a couple of important points, and we will elaborate on that further. Dana Schmalz, for instance, illustrates in one of her articles the elasticity of the term. Roger Zetter has argued that this distinction is subject of a political game, and Heaven Crawley demonstrated that the reality is far too complex as to be captured by these neat categories. And recently, the United Nations New York Declaration reassured us that the international community should, and I quote, fully protect the human rights of all refugees and migrants, regardless of their status. All are rights holders. So it thus emphasizes a key commonality, being human. Whilst as a consequence, it seems to me that this is somewhat blurring the line between two categories. Also, a recent related UNHCR paper from 2017 goes one step further and consolidates the category of persons in need of international protection, which covers again migrants and refugees exposed to certain risks in their country of origin. Finally, Zetter recently suggested that fiddling with this categorization, and I quote, whilst Rome is burning, meaning whilst tens of millions suffer from human rights abuses, could be considered rather cynical. With this panel debate, we do not aim to overcome the shortcomings, the problems and controversies. We do not aim to reconcile legal and administrative with academic purposes or arrive at any unified understanding. Rather, we aim to throw light at the state of the art of scholarly thinking, illustrate the diversity of academic approaches and discursive practices, whilst adding some more transparency to these. And thereby we aim to provide a stage for a reflexive and critical approach with regards to these concepts, which are all too often used in a rather colloquial fashion. And to debate these matters, we have invited three distinguished scholars, Roger Zetter, Heaven Crawley, and Dana Schmalz. Roger is Emeritus Professor at the Refugee Studies Center at the University of Oxford, where he served as a director until 2011. And he is also founding editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies. Heaven is professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University and director of the Migration for Development and Equality Hub on South-South migration. And Dana has been a fellow at the law school, Columbia University, though she is now back at her main position as researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg and Berlin. We arranged the debate along 4 questions, and this will take us around 1 hour. And afterwards, we invite the audience to join the debate by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now to our panelists. I would like to ask Heaven first. Is it useful to distinguish between migration and forced migration and between migrants and refugees? And if yes, what would be the main parameters for such categories and where would you set the threshold? Heaven, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for the organisation of this event, which I think is timely in the sense that these issues, many of them are coming to a head, if you like, in what we're seeing around the world in terms of the way in which these issues are being talked about. In response to your question, I think in general terms, I would say no, it's not a helpful thing to differentiate between categories in this way, not least because there are many kinds of migrants and many kinds of refugees, even within those very broad categories. I understand, of course, that historically there have been good reasons for wanting to have differentiation between categories, primarily, of course, because there have been very different legal frameworks for the protection of refugees and the rights that are afforded to them relative to other groups of people on the move. And that, of course, is linked to issues of state sovereignty and to the fact that there is a right to claim asylum, whereas there is not a right to migrate. And so there are some fundamental differences historically in the differentiation between those categories. But I think there have been a lot of changes, and really migration has increased in both its scale on the one hand and its complexity on the other, and in the way in which the politics of migration, which I'm sure Roger and others will talk about, have changed the nature of the way that these categories have been utilised. So first of all, and Frank, from our research on the MedBig project, I know you're fully aware of this, we see increasingly complex journeys, and not just journeys, but increasingly complex migration trajectories. People are on the move for longer, often because they are prevented from going to where they originally intended to or where they would like to go because of migration policy, or because their own decisions shift over time as their circumstances change. And so as people move over time and over space, so too they move in and out of categories. We saw this in our MedMig research, particularly with, for example, Syrians who became stuck in some senses in Turkey and then moved on and were treated as economic migrants. And on the other hand, various migrants who were treated as economic migrants in the West African context, but effectively became in need of protection because of violence in the Libyan context. The other issue is that, and I think it's really important to acknowledge this, that very few people now are actually able to benefit from the refugee category. Internally displaced people, people who are within contexts where there is no signatory to the 51 Convention, and there are countries in that category, people who enter into countries where there is no formal process or where the process has become so legalistic and technical that their possibilities of securing protection as refugees is very limited. And indeed, I've done a lot of work around issues of gender, and we find that certain groups fall outside of the category of refugee protection, even though we know their experiences might warrant that protection. And so for me, the issue here is the way in which categories themselves and the distinction between migrants and refugees are increasingly being used to manipulate, to manage, and to exclude, rather than to think about how they might be usefully employed in order to be able to protect people. And we see this, of course, in policy and political terms, but we also see it in the media. And I remember when the work we were doing as part of the so-called refugee or migration crisis in Europe, 2015, still ongoing, was underway. Al Jazeera on the one hand was refusing to talk about migrants, would only talk about refugees. BBC on the other hand would only talk about migrants and wouldn't talk about refugees, because both politically understood that those categories were highly laden. So for me, I think the problem with categories is that they are proving to be very unhelpful in the political reality in which we live and in the empirical reality of the complexity of people's lives. And that instead, and I've argued this in some of my recent work, we need to focus not on the categories and who's in them, but how the boundaries between the categories are being constructed. Who decides who is and isn't in which category? And I don't just mean legally now, I mean representationally and discursively. And as you alluded to at the beginning, Franck, I think we need to go beyond categories. We need to think of people as human beings and as human beings with rights as human beings. Because the approach we have at the moment with categories ends up with this very individualized and particular kind of discursive framework, which undermines the potential for solidarity between those who are marginalized and structurally excluded from the kinds of rights and protection that they might need and potentially have access to. So I think there's a possibility of new forms of transnational solidarity, if you like, if we go beyond the categories and look at kind of what people have in common in terms of their needs and experiences, rather than what differentiates them from one another. So that's my opener. I'm sure we'll have much more around that. But in answer to your question, no, I'm giving you a straight answer to a straight question. But of course, it's more complicated than that might seem.
Thank you, Heaven. I'm handing over to Ulrike now.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. Please go ahead, Roger. I'm very sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much. In many ways, I agree, I think, with Heaven's opening statements, but I approach this question slightly differently with another question. The key issue, it seems to me here, is it useful for whom and for what purposes? So whilst I agree with Heaven's contention that we're dealing with multi-causal factors and very complex transnational movements, it does seem to me that there is, from a purist social science research point of view, it is quite useful to understand the different kind of social dynamics and structures that help to shape mobility patterns, the processes, the timings, the destinations, and as Heaven said, sometimes the transitions between different modes and different categories en route, and trying to understand some of the social, political, and economic consequences for these different forms of movement, these different categories, if you will. And it seems to me that understanding the changing dimensions of mobility and what causes them, mixed migration flows, irregular migration, the global reach of patterns of mobility, the impact of environmental degradation and climate change, I think we can begin to develop a much more nuanced understanding of how communities and individuals display and present mobility dynamics and their agency as part of their coping capacities. It seems to me that the key point is there are many different forms of migration from a social science perspective that share similar empirical, theoretical, methodological, and political concerns, precisely as Heaven has said. But it seems to me that the significance of looking at different categories is to look at the way there are different emphases and different inflections of these variables. But obviously, if we now turn the question, is it useful for state and policymakers? The usefulness and distinction here, of course, is very different indeed. Precisely as Heaven said, on the positive side, it's about upholding international legal obligations for refugee protection and the rights of migrants, but much more, of course, the significance of categorization and fractioning the label, as I would term it, is to enable management, regulation of entry, protecting borders and labor markets. The problem, of course, is that as social scientists involved in migration, our work is often bent to serve the interests of policymakers and co-opted, for whom, from a policymaking perspective, of course, precision and categories and distinctions are absolutely vital. So it seems to me that what I conclude here is that a single analytical category, such as refugee or economic migrant and so on, has some purpose, although perhaps very limited in the current context for researchers. But these categories are obviously absolutely core to policymakers. And so it seems to me that the kind of parameters one might think of are not that different between researchers and policymakers, but rather it's the saliency of particular factors and particular parameters that are very, very different between the social science lens and the lens of policymakers.
Thank you so much. I will hand over to Dana, to you now. Would you like me to repeat the question, or is it okay?
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Franck and Ulrike and myself and FFVT for having us. And I can pretty much agree with everything that's been said so far, but to answer to the question, I would arrive at a different answer and really say, yes, this distinction is useful to uphold, or useful for what maybe worth upholding in our current striving for a more just migration arrangement in the world. So I believe that when we understand, or when we look at the categories of refugees and migrants, what is essential is that they are not essential. What is crucial is to see them as normative categories and not as depicting some pre-existing reality. So I believe the moment we take them as categories which are precisely not neatly fitting, but still for having a normative purpose, there is something very important about these categories. And what is it? I think in the world, we can argue abstractly in favor of a world with complete freedom of movement, but in the world we're at, the rule is that states are free to control migration, to govern their borders. And in this world we're living in, the refugee concept has this very fundamental role of an exception of the one case in international law, but I'll come to that in a moment, much broader normative sense, I believe, of an exception to the rule that states can close their borders. So I think this is the reason why it's worth upholding, that we would rather work with this exception than give it up. All the complexities of migration journeys granted and all the difficulties of these drawing boundaries between these categories. And I mean, then this becomes the next big question. But to say a little bit about this, why I think it's much more than just a legal concept. The refugee notion for me, or the refugee concept, really refers to a basic idea that is as old as the territorial state framework, where the rule that the stranger in dire distress at the border must be saved, or must be given entry in order to save him or her, is kind of counterbalancing the arbitrariness of territorial delimitation. So in a modern idea of law, which is based on ideas of human equality and freedom, the arbitrariness of borders, where we just say along those borders we care about the rights of person, and behind the borders we do not care about these rights anymore, seems pretty hard to sustain. And it's kind of by having this counterbalancing exception of the refugee that we say in certain cases we still owe something to the stranger at the border, that this whole framework even works. So I believe this very fundamental idea about the refugee underlies our normative discourse today, and also the legal concept as it developed in 20th century. And it's by this role of an exception, which I guess we'll come to the discourse in a moment, that this remains very influential in shaping migration debates today, and not only in a negative sense. The question then becomes really, who should we understand as a refugee, and how should we draw these boundaries? And I strongly believe that the basic idea which underlies the refugee concept is a person whose life or liberty or life or freedom is under threat and who's at the border. So the definition of the 1951 Convention is much narrower, and maybe too narrow. Not maybe, I think it is too narrow. And we have other propositions in law, in international law, for refugee definitions. We have, Franck, you've mentioned this in the introduction, that there are lots of concepts of people in need of international protection. And I think rather than kind of following the legal definition and constructing the refugee as a very narrow category, and then talking about something else, we should try to really work on broadening the refugee concept, the refugee category, because it carries this strong normative claim, which is traded, that the territorial state can only be considered a just arrangement if there is this exception for letting in certain people at the border. So it's, I view it as a sort of block in the door of the territorial state, and I think we should not give up this block, but rather try to push it open a little further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to the three of you. I would like to turn to, or pick up exactly where you left off on the repeated mentioning on discourses, and turn to this, now really do turn to the second question of what it is, or what is the discursive meaning of the use of the term migrant or refugee? Does it matter for our discussion on the different types of mobile people, how those who are currently categorized as refugees or migrants are treated by the different governments and societies? I would like to start with you, Roger, now.
Thank you. I'm happy to go first. I think I was not scheduled to do so, but I'm prepared to do that on the second question. It seems to me that the discursive purposes really of looking at issues of refugees and migrants is really, it seems to me the key kind of challenge, the key question is really to analyze different kinds of movement as social processes, in which perhaps the human agency and social networks play a key role, and they span, notably in transnational context. And these networks and agency, it seems to me, span whatever category that we are under, we put under the lens. And I think back really to the work of people like Anthony Richmond decades ago, who proposed a kind of continuum, if you like, of a way of analysing migratory movements, which embrace a spectrum of categories, but also more particularly a spectrum of factors, drivers as we would perhaps now term them, or factors which determine the nature of migration, the routes that are chosen, and to an extent the kind of categories, if you like, that individuals might see themselves best fitting. But the key point, it seemed to me, that what Richmond was making years ago, and we're still trying to confront this challenge now in our discourse, is that the kind of binary, as it were, between refugees and migrants or other categories of people on the move who do not neatly fit the international legal framework of refugees, is that this binary is premised on the distinction between forced and voluntary. And that really is a very simplistic way of looking at the kind of cause-effect relationships that lead to the different distinctions, the different kinds of movement. And I think we, as Helen said really in her opening statement, the discourse now is very much focused on multivariate causes and processes and patterns, rather than the particular categories which individuals or groups would feed into. The problem, of course, is that if we look at the two global compacts on safe and orderly migration and the compact on refugees, of course, they just reinforce the binary, which many of us as researchers have been trying to challenge for many, many years. But it's really trying to disaggregate, if you like, the many different motives, the different drivers of migration and displacement, and then reaggregating them in terms of perhaps different kind of typologies, which embrace different kinds of spatial outcomes, the complexity of mixed motives, all of which, of course, is mediated by political context, economic, and, of course, existential factors that underpin the nature of movement. But I think it's also important, again, thinking back to what David Turton reminded us of years and years ago, that in a sense, as much as the discursive challenge is trying to resolve a lot of the kind of methodological and substantive questions of constructing categories or not of different people on the move, what we really need to be focusing on, I think, is the lived experiences of all displaced people, and to see them as ordinary people with as purposive actors, embedded in particular and very often harmful social and historic consequences. And so it seems to me that, as Turton said, and I guess it's a question we're still grappling with discursively, rather than seeing particular categories and conceptualizing categories around, as we would argue, a kind of false empirical reality, we should be conceptualizing the categories around the way in which different social constructs are established, such as membership, citizenship, social belonging, alienation, and exclusion. The problem, of course, is that in the end, whatever our discursive formation and the kind of language we use to account for and describe and understand the different patterns and processes of migration, however they are replicated and refined, the problem is that, of course, policy and practice tends to reinforce the dehumanizing processes, which this kind of broader conceptualization of discursive approaches that Turton suggested, of course, challenges.
Thank you very much. Dana, may I ask you to continue?
Sure, yes. So the discursive role of these concepts, I mean, I come to this question also as a legal scholar. And first, when we have a concept also in law, as we do with the refugee concept, we tend to think, well, that's where, for us at least, it breaks down to. We can define what is a refugee. Now, speaking about these categories, what is very interesting to me to see this role, this normative significance beyond the legal significance, is really all these tropes around real refugees. And I think they're very telling, because if you really were just looking for a legal distinction, if this were what mattered normatively, you could just say whoever claims to be a refugee can then file a claim for asylum, and the legal procedure will find out whether it's a real refugee. That's how usually legal definitions are used. And this whole speaking about real refugees actually does something else. It claims that already using the term, using the label for oneself is kind of an act with normative significance. Why else would you kind of deny someone, or also other people, to speak about a group as refugees if maybe it would turn out that they're not real refugees in a legal sense. So I think what this weird trope, and this is being used in various manners, it's been spoken about label fraud in a German context, for instance. I think what this really shows is that there is a fear of the influence of this refugee concept in discourse, meaning the influence as saying those people have a legitimate claim, maybe even regardless of what the law ultimately says. They might have a legitimate claim even though they are found not to have an asylum claim by legal procedures. And I think so, and we do have this, haven't mentioned the media, also specific statements of we will use the term this way or that way. I think there is a lot of awareness of how by labeling, by categorizing, one makes a statement about the legitimacy of migration of certain groups. And I mean, again, to me, coming from this whole question of how can we maybe draw on the normative significance of the refugee concept, trying to broaden the legal categories, I think this can also be a positive note that even those people trying to cut down on migration still do not give up the refugee concept. They do not say, just close the borders to everybody. They try of constructing all these stories about real refugees. So that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Heaven, may return to you.
Thank you very much. Going back to the initial question, which is around discursive purpose, I think it's very much, as Roger says, purpose for whom? I mean, there are different purposes to which these categories are put. But for many of us, the categories, particularly the refugee category, were really categories intended to protect, to be able to understand, to be able to create mechanisms for addressing the absence of opportunity and protection in countries of origin. But I mean, we know that increasingly, not just the refugee category, but actually the migrant category has been used to stigmatize, to marginalize and exclude. And I think, you know, as Franck said in his introduction, that matters, not just because we're talking about this discursively as academics, but because it really makes a difference to the lives of those who move. But the key for me, and this is where it starts probably to get a little bit controversial, but links back more into some of my current work with the MIDEC Hub, is we tend to become very myopic around migration. We tend to think of, you know, these kind of differentiations between migrants and refugees, or between different forms of migration. But ultimately, even when we use that phrase, or even when we talk about migration, we are kind of skirting over huge structural inequalities with which migration is associated. We're not talking about rich white men moving for business. We're not talking about certain categories of migrant. We are talking about highly racialized, highly gendered, highly income dependent structures of inequality around which migration is situated, embedded, and interacts with. And I don't really honestly believe that we can grapple with some of these debates around migration or the use of categories without grappling with some of those deeper structural inequalities within which migration debates are situated. Because yes, we have some discussions around particularly race in relation to migration, and the use of categories to include or exclude, include often white, exclude often black in the global north. But of course, in the global south, we have similar things happening with different groups of Africans. In South Africa, for example, you see other forms of xenophobia taking place. I don't think we can talk about these things in the way in which categories are harnessed without talking about those structural inequalities, because to do so kind of, you know, suggests that somehow migration and migrants are separate from these big fractures that differentiate who is and isn't entitled, not just to the right to move or the right to work or the right to, you know, play or love, but the right to be safe and to exist in a context where your rights are respected. That seems pretty fundamental to me. And so I don't see when rights are so allied to these structural inequalities of various kinds, we can talk discursively about migration and categories without engaging with those wider structural inequalities. And it might sound off point in some sense, but I've become acutely conscious since we started doing this work about the relationship between migration and inequality in the context of the Global South, that one of the things that happens in the Global North all the time is a failure or refusal to engage with the structural inequalities that exist in the first place, that mean that 85–90% of refugees never get Europe or the Global North. And that even if they do, they get treated in this way because they're the wrong color, the wrong religion, whatever else. So you become very acutely aware that this is a Global North discussion, a Global North discourse, which serves in itself particular purposes, because the dominant kind of drivers of some of the policies and of the international positions around some of these things, for want of a better word, is primarily, not exclusively, I don't want to disempower those really important things happening in the Global South, but it's being driven by the interests of the Global North. And so those global inequalities, as well as those social and structural inequalities, are for me fundamental to sort of talking about the construction of categories. It wasn't what I had written down on my notes, but it struck me as suddenly being relevant to the conversation.
Great, thank you very much for your responses. I would like to invite the audience. If you have questions, please do write them in the Q&A section. We will collect the questions and raise them later after the panel discussion. Turning to the next question, how do we deal with the tension between state categorization, which has the purpose of governing migration, and the scientific typicalization, which has the purpose to enhance our very understanding of human behavior? Dana, I would like to start with you and ask you to respond.
Sure. Well, I think in this juxtaposition of state categorization and scientific categorization, I have difficulty seeing what scientific would mean, because again, as I said in the beginning, I think we can't find any distinctions by exploring reality. All these categories we're giving, we're making in order to describe diverse experiences, and it's absolutely clear that whatever criteria we choose, forced, involuntary, hardship, these are all continuum. So I think when thinking about the academic perspective, the scholarly perspective, we do not have these neat categories. And then, so what is it really what we confront, what we compare to the legal discourse, to the state discourse? I mean, I guess the perspective I would take is that there is a normative discourse going on about how to set those boundaries, and the question really is, who can have a voice in this discourse? I maybe put myself against a whole strand of moral philosophy by saying I do not think that we can sit back and think about what the right categorizations are and say who has a right, to whom do we owe something, because who is that we who owes something? So I think all these all the discourse beyond or outside the state of saying, well, how should we draw the boundaries, if we draw any, or how should the rules be of crossing borders, must be seen as discourses that are ultimately political discourses. And then what is really striking is that in migration discourses, there's a huge asymmetry between those who have a voice in them, who are usually not those who are trying to migrate, or at least not migrate under conditions of hardship and conditions of closed borders. And this applies to specific state rules. So in a specific state, I think there is this asymmetry. And there is also clearly a global asymmetry in who shapes this discourse. And I can only agree to what Heaven just said, that there is clearly also dominance of the global north in determining what rules of mobility apply to international movements. So I think really, well, I moved away a little bit from the question, I apologize, but I think if we look at state categorization and scientific or academic, what really is there to point out is to point out how the democratic discourse is a bit faulty when it comes to migration rules, how we really must pay attention to how to feed into other political voices, which usually are not represented there.
Thank you. Heaven, may we turn to you, please?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to unpack the question a bit, if I may, because first of all, I think scientific or academic typologies are a problem in themselves, actually. I mean, I'm not a fan. I'm a geographer by training, if you like, but I don't, and geographers have typically done a lot of typologizing, but I don't think it's necessarily particularly helpful. I mean, first of all, I think typologies tend to flatten out human differences in a way that doesn't necessarily get us any closer to understanding. I know there's a purposefulness of that flattening, which is to create a sort of sense of understanding and patterns, but not often in ways that might be helpful. I think there's also a problem with the kind of intersectionality that then gets associated with those typologies. So the relationships between different aspects of human identity get lost. And as I said earlier, and I guess it comes back to my other point about structure inequality, it tends to separate, those typologies tend to separate people from structures. And I'm very interested in the kind of structural embeddedness of people's experiences rather than the typologies themselves. And of course, there are plenty of silos with academia, and I think, you know, you see it within, and there's been debates about this for years, if not decades, and many of them Roger will be familiar with in the Journal of Refugee Studies, between, you know, the specificity of otherwise of refugee studies versus migration studies and vice versa. But we can have a lot of those debates sometimes, and they become very kind of inward looking and internal. So there's kind of, I have a problem with the state, with the scientific typology issue. But I think we also need to be very cautious about presupposing, and Roger alluded to this earlier, that somehow there is a separation between how the states use categories and how we as academics use categories. We regularly get co-opted into this, and we regularly think we're going to change it and often find ourselves not changing it or somehow being part of it. I used to work in the UK Home Office. Roger did some work with me. You kind of think you can change it from the inside out, but these structures are very big and very strong. And sometimes we get sort of our categories, our new categories, intended to open up and to broaden, as Dana says, you know, to push out at the boundaries of where the categories are positioned. And they are often not as successful as we would like, precisely because, you know, states in the broadest sense, but policymakers and politicians more specifically, realize that there is a sort of mutually reinforcing relationship between the knowledge production around some of these categories and how they then inform them. So I think we need to sort of be careful of sort of somehow thinking we can distance ourselves from the horrors of how policymakers and politicians use categories. We are part of the same process, albeit that we might come at it with a different intent. And we need to be very conscious of that, because we have power ourselves that can get used in particular ways if you publish something and then it kind of gets co-opted by others. So, but that's why for me, as Dana suggested, pushing out the categories and challenging the construction of them is as important, if not more so, than who's in the categories themselves, because as academics and as people interested in political process, and I suppose it depends what kind of academic you are, but that's where I position myself, then it's those processes that are as interesting as the migrants themselves and whether or not they fit into a particular category, if that makes sense. So yeah, just a sort of like word of caution about thinking that academics are all good in this particular thing, as if we somehow are out with the broader processes, because we're part of them often.
Thank you, which is particularly also relevant because much of the research is thought to be policy oriented or relevant. So thank you very much. Roger, may we turn to you, please?
Yes, thank you. I suppose I rather presumptuously took the question of the we to be researchers and academics. And I suppose my starting position is very much, as Dana said, that we are in quite a powerful position, a very privileged position of being able to give voice to the millions who don't have a voice, to challenge the nature of the categories that are imposed on them, and to challenge the asymmetries that she talked about. And it's very interesting that Heaven alluded to her time at the Home Office and the research that I did for the Home Office. This was quite a long time ago, the late 1990s. And just absolutely coincidentally, I was going to mention an anecdote of precisely that time. So it's interesting that Heaven just we haven't prepared beforehand, but raised the same question. We were involved in initial research, which was looking at some highly political processes to disperse asylum seekers. And none of the research was published. The government just put a lid on it. And it very quickly became clear to us that the government was not really interested in evidence-based policy, but quite the reverse. It wanted policy-based evidence. And it was a hard lesson, but it's a crucial lesson, I think, for researchers. And it's the perennial question that we face of our work either being suppressed or perhaps worse still co-opted by governments. And clearly in the field that we're now involved in, migration and refugees, that co-optation can literally be a matter of life and death. So just to unpack the question a little bit more, I see it from, I guess, two perspectives. One, I suppose, substantively, and I think this has been covered by Heaven and Dana, really, what is it that we're researching? How is it that in what ways can our research really unpack the complex range of structural factors and the political context and the existential threats that govern the nature and socioeconomic and state fragility and so on, that in a sense become the nexus, the complexity of factors that produce people on the move. And it seems to me that the crucial role of research is to keep unpacking these factors, keep reminding policymakers, although they may not be our immediate clients and audience, to remind them of the complexity, the conceptual complexity and the empirical complexity of the reality in which migration, different patterns and processes of movement take place. I think the second point, and rather more prosaic, I suppose, and this is very much, I guess, for all of us, because we are really at this kind of research policy interface. We're theoreticians, but we're not speaking to theoreticians. We're wanting to change the world inevitably. It seems to me that here we need to think of the kind of strategies for engaging with policymakers, for engaging with state actors, and ways in which we can avoid or prevent the dangers of the co-optation of our research and our empirical findings. It does mean, prosaically, very good, rigorous, evidence-based research. It means constantly presenting that research in policymaking fora. It does mean effective lobbying and advocacy. It does mean being very, very clear about the terms of reference that we write for ourselves or that we're asked to satisfy from donors or governments and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that if we're thinking about this, the question, how do we deal with this tension? I think we have to deal with it in these two ways. Substantively, what is it we're researching? How might our research and our categories or non-categories be translated and be co-opted into the realm of public policy and public discourse? And then secondly, I think, and in a sense, this is stating the obvious, being very, very careful about the actual strategies for our engagement with policymakers and engaging with the public domain, the media as well.
Thank you very much. Drawing on the last aspect of unpacking or keeping unpacking categories, concepts that we work with, that we try to understand, or that we perhaps also reproduce in our work, I would like to raise the last question from our list and then turn to the questions that the audience has raised so far. And the question that I'm going to ask links up closely with one of the participants here who had asked how can we or how can these categories be overcome? And I would like to ask you, could you think of an alternative criteria or parameters to identify different patterns and categories of mobility at stake, such as vulnerability, agency, or other concepts? And Heaven, I would like to start with you and give you the floor.
This is a really tricky question. It's a good question. It's a tricky question. I think we need to get real about this. We can't move away from categories or pretend categories don't exist. If we replace categories with other categories, they almost invariably are problematic for other reasons. And some of the ones that you named, particularly in relation to vulnerability, for example, I find quite problematic because they, again, are sort of somehow mutually exclusive, as if you're only one thing or the other. So I don't think we can get away from categories because they always will be problematic, because they have embedded in them the politics of boundary, essentially. And categories are how we organize ourselves as human beings, socially, politically. Categories are a feature of that process. I suppose what I think we can do, though, and again, Roger alluded to this, it depends on who we are, but I think certainly what some of us would want to do is much more really to shift away from the way in which we think about categories. So whilst we're very deliberately and kind of consciously, if you like, in this particular debate, unpacking categories and critically reflecting on the way in which they're constructed and the purpose that they serve, I don't think that's the case in much of what happens in the world, including a lot of what happens in academia. There is a kind of taken for grantedness about some of these categories. There's also an investment in these categories, including an academic investment in certain categories as well, in kind of maintaining this notion of particularity around certain types of movement. So I think we need to be honest about that and kind of be more critically reflective of the way in which those purposes, those categories serve, as was said earlier, but also for us as academics. And I think we need to, and I think Dana, you mentioned this earlier, and also Franck in his introduction, we need to stop thinking of categories as containers, as if somehow, there's something that people can be placed into, like a small child putting coloured blocks into a bucket. That is not what a category is, or certainly not what it should be. It's a much more complex social normative construction. And just in preparation for this event, I was thinking, okay, so what's the opposite of categories? What would that be? What could be something different? And actually, when you kind of Google synonyms and antonyms for categories, which is the sort of thing you do before an online debate like this, because you're trying to think of something that kind of answers the questions, there are very few, and that's, I think, interesting in itself. So I came up with a few. So in terms of containment, it kind of links quite closely to categories. And words like unwrapping came in, which I think kind of resonated with Roger's point. Releasing, venting, freeing, eliminating. They're all words that are about seeing the possibilities beyond the categories, not just from a policy point of view or from an academic point of view, but ultimately also for the people who get contained by the categories. Because, and Dana mentioned this earlier in terms of the kind of the voices of those who don't get to speak. There are really important things that people want to hold about refugeness as a refugee identity, but many people also find it stigmatizing and limiting and don't necessarily want to be contained by it, albeit that label can be purposeful in securing access to certain things, including protection. So there's something about being able to step in and out of the categories rather than thinking that they can be got rid of, if that makes sense. It's not a proper answer, but it's the best I can do, I'm afraid, because I think it's a really complicated one and one that luckily Franck let us off the hook at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, it is a very tricky question. Roger, I would still like to pose it to you as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the most challenging of the 4 questions in many ways. Can we deal and work with a world without categories when our life and our livelihoods to a certain extent depend on them? It's often a question I asked myself when I was director of the Refugee Studies Centre. In a different world, would we have given ourselves a different label, a different category? But anyway, there we were. I suppose I don't have a particularly sort of well worked out answer to this. I suppose my approach was really to think, well, can we approach the subject matter of mobility without categories, knowing how important the categories are to us, how destructive those categories can be from the point of view of their co-optation by policymakers and so on. And it seemed to me that maybe what we could be thinking of is not particular categories of people on the move and putting people, as Heaven said, erroneously into these kind of boxes and containers, but thinking more about the kind of pathways of mobility, the pathways that people choose and why and under what circumstances, and the particular kind of processes that they might use, the sort of backwards and forwards movements that make it very hard to argue that people are necessarily refugees when they claim refugee status, and yet 6 months later will move back across the border, move back home for a period of time, and then reinsert themselves as a refugee category across the border and so on. So we need to be thinking very much about the kind of pathways of mobility, which are outside the notion of a particular kind of category of person behaving in a particular kind of way, moving in a particular kind of well-worn and well-established pattern. We need to think about the processes. We need to think about the different kind of spatial dimensions of mobility, the distances that people travel and why, the kind of destinations they choose, or maybe the destinations that are imposed on them or that arrive perhaps by accident and serendipity. We need to think, it seems to me, about the temporal side of this, the backwards and forwards movement that I mentioned, that people are mobile at some stages in their lives. They might be mobile because of particular existential threats, but then they might be stationary for a period of time, and then there will be an onward movement. And then we need to think, I think, also about modes of movement, the different modes that people deploy as part of their patterns of mobility, why and how and under what circumstances. So in a sense, I'm taking a category, a very big category of people on the move, rather than making perhaps more precise definitions of categories within that overarching architecture. But if we take mobility as a concept and as a process, perhaps we can unpack it in these kind of terms. And certainly agency and vulnerability could be ways of looking at these different forms of mobility as well. What agency do people use to adopt particular kinds of modes or particular kind of pathways or particular kinds of temporal patterns? So that would be my not at all satisfactory take on thinking outside the box, thinking outside the categories.
Thank you very much. Dana, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I could very much agree with what Heaven and Roger said about how those might be useful categories for thinking about mobility. I mean, I take the question of what parameters, criteria we can identify also a little bit as what criteria, parameters for normative responses, for legal responses again. And there, I think also it's an extremely relevant question because criteria like vulnerability have a huge impact in how migration situations are handled, and sometimes we see how there are in court judgments, for instance, there are argumentations in trying to interpret jurisdiction for it, which precisely try to figure out what are good boundaries to draw on the basis of the legal norms we have. And I personally think vulnerability is a very dangerous criterion for legal responses. I think in a way, it might be more dangerous than the territorial delimitation we now often operate with, because it can be, it very much hides how decisions are made. Vulnerability is an extremely blurred criterion. I also think it's a dangerous idea when we forget that we are all extremely vulnerable. I'm so vulnerable. My vulnerability is covered by infrastructure, and if you take this infrastructure away, there is very little left to be in this world. So I think when we also now see that we accept a few families with sick children from Moria, there is always this criterion of specific vulnerability. And I I do think we should be, I don't think we should orient our legal responses at this criteria. Now, agency is much more one where I think if we focus on agency, we actually see right now the legal responses are in a sense oriented at agency because they respond to migration, and migration is agency and people choose to migrate. So rather than looking at the mobility, actually it brings us to look at the way states hinder agency and migration, and to look at all the strategies states do employ, often in the gray zones of legality, which go either illegal or unchallenged, because it's very difficult in these areas to challenge state action. So I think thinking about mobility along agency is actually helpful in turning the view. Then as a last remark on this point, I do think, as I said in the very beginning, that the refugee concept at the basis is worth upholding in the ways we talk about migration justice. I also think that we should try to broaden it. And then I do think that it's not the only concept to work with when talking about migration justice. So when we try to imagine what lies ahead the next decades, and we will see large-scale migration linked to climate change, then I do think that there should be schemes which maybe connect with responsibility states have for climate change that also allow for migration. And the refugee concept, I don't think it's a useful fitting concept for responding to those needs of migration, but I really do think that it's a task for academics in the field of migration of thinking how fair responses could look like. So that's my take.
Thank you very, very much for all your responses.